All right, good afternoon, everyone. I am Rick Moreno. This is Mariana. Just a little bit of context. This is work we've been doing together with others maybe 6-7 years. Part of the fruit of this work is in the publication. They're selling at the front desk. Another dimension of this work. So there's a history of a very good friendship and a particular type of dialogue and definite very, I think, practical and very impacting consequences that a dialogue like this can generate. And where I come from is I set up, for today's in particular, I use the background in this work in particular from sort of a 21st, 20th century perspective, post-Cartesian, post-Kantian context as a way, just like the professor did with children, using superheroes and cartoons as a context for engagement with the youth, but as an engagement with where our world is at now. So that tradition is called Phenomenology, and it has a lot of resonances, especially in the continental Europe, but it is present in America. It has some resistance in Britain and Germany, although much of its origins are in Germany. And it parallels quite well from a philosophical and sort of human perspective with the apophatic tradition of Eastern and Western Christianity. And you have many authors today still working in the phenomenological tradition from a faith-based perspective. In the Orthodox tradition, Christos Yanros from the Greek Orthodox Church, John Panteleimon Mousakis up here from Boston does a lot in this area, as well as many others in the Latin Catholic tradition, the French in particular, Jean-Luc Marion, Jean-Yves Lacoste, take this philosophical tradition and begin to open up what its opening is and leading towards a theological end. That creates a great opportunity to dialogue with Christianity, orthodoxy, patristic thought, and help relativize it to a context where people are coming from very different backgrounds, experiences, traditions, and it really can be extremely powerful and practical. So a little bit of background is, so where does phenomenology come from? It stems from German, Prussian thinkers. It particularly has a encapsulation, sort of a moment of definition and opening with Edmund Husserl and a number of his texts. One of their most known is The Crisis of the European Sciences. And what that does for Western thought is it brings it to sort of a clarity. As much as we want to base things simply on reason, we find ourselves still lacking things. Reason can't exhaust the fullness of human experience. Reason can open us up to new depths. Sciences can open us up to new clarities and certain forms of truth, but it cannot encapsulate truth in the largest and comprehensive sense. There's a particular technical word they use which is called reduction. And reduction is this process of allowing reality to show itself to the viewer. And that process of allowing reality to show itself to the viewer is in some way trying to remove any misconceptions that we, consciousness, human consciousness, can bring to what the truth of reality is. And this can be in the human sciences, it can be in human relationships, sociology sort of bred through this tradition in many ways. But with the practice of the reduction or the purification, it's actually a practice of intellectual and even spiritual purification. What was come to see was it's sort of like a snake chasing its tail. There is no end to this process. It continues. It's an infinite process. The more that we come to conclusions and definitions, the more the question, the original question, and the questions that are derivative for continue to open up and create more mystery. So this is where you can see the parallel to the apophatic tradition is quite strong. Along with that, it bases itself on a deep meditation on the question of the relationship of infinite reality, that which is beyond our finitude, and the question of our finitude, and how these two aren't just a stable, static truth. Human existence is constantly fluctuating between more affective, more infinite senses of human experience and more finite senses. So many times we might equate death with finitude. The idea of dying and coming to an end is the finite marker. But equally as much, you can recognize death as an infinite horizon. So you see how with health care and the sense of the person when it comes to the most critical nature of dying of another, witnessing another death, or even contemplating one's death, or even the death of the community many times nowadays, when we've seen genocide or spiritual communities that have suffered, that there is a deep question of what was the presence and the meaning of that person, that identity, the community of that identity in a particular place, in a particular time. And there is a sense of closure and finite to that, but then there's also an infinite horizon, a question, and a deeper question that's opened up in those particular contexts and circumstances. So the reality of the question is what begins this whole notion. We're born, and we're born into a mystery. And that mystery is really all-encompassing. From the tiniest empirical detail to the most loftiest question of the universe and the stars, not to speak of the theological questions of God and what does it mean to live in the light of God's image and likeness. The question is dreaded, this disenchanting itself derived. The relation with death is thought as an experience of nothingness in time. Here we are looking for other dimensions of meaning, both the meaning of time and the meaning of death. So you see phenomenology with this type of intentionality is trying to go into the meaninglessness, or what can be perceived as meaningless, into the depths of a question, and from that retrieve new experiences, new reality, a future, a horizon that might not have been thought of before. And in many ways, in the life of Christ, in his incarnation, when he confronts the world around him, the fears, the difficulties of others, this is this horizon of meaninglessness that was found in his own time and place that he's willing to go to. So the phenomenological encounter is a very human encounter. It's a very incarnational encounter, as much as the principles might be seen as abstract and difficult to deal with. So the question of a paradigm and the question of death is quite interesting. Death is this existential reality that we have to face. We can't not face it. And the question of a paradigm is sort of a scientific or historical manifestation that seems to give definition or clarity to help us understand our experience. And in some ways, you might want to say that death is the paradigm, but even in this context, death exceeds being a paradigm and is beyond any form of conceptualization. A paradigm relies on conceptualization. Death and the experience of death brings us beyond this horizon. This was particularly noted by the Jewish phenomenologist Emmanuel Levinas, who was a student of Husserl and also a student of Martin Heidegger, who's a very important player in the phenomenological tradition, and dealing quite honestly, quite literally, with much of the nihilism that began to develop in this period of time with Nietzsche and others. Nihilism that you don't want to necessarily say is wrong or negative, but is very authentic to human experience if we're open to what human experience is. And nowadays, I say, within the past 10 years, particularly, you see nihilism just take hold of our secular culture and move people to a whole new level of absurdity, to insanity, to craziness in our culture. So we have to have a way to be able to talk to the nihilism. And the phenomenological context gives that. And Emmanuel Levinas, better than most, gives us many very deep and very almost serious insights into what it means to confront the real truth of nihilism. Nihilism's truth isn't in its absurdity. It's in its question of what are our communities and what are the relationships we share, especially in light of the dying of a loved one, but even the dying of a stranger. And how we should all be indicted because we can't embrace the death of the stranger as the death of a loved one. That the other, in their radical otherness, challenges us to a new level and a new question of our own existence as a human that we are not embracing. So this is a question of transformation at this point. When we have this great opening to the mystery of the other, then we are called to be willing to be transformed. So these are some beautiful lines that express this, and I'll just read them because they speak for themselves so powerfully. The other who exposes himself to me is entrusted to me, and there is no debt, so it can't be an economic relation. There's no economic relation here in regard to the other, for what is due is unpayable. It's an infinite value. Being made in the image and likeness of God is an infinite value. One is never free of it. We're always held in this relation, one way or another. And the other individuates me in the responsibility I have for him. So it's in this confrontation with the infinite found in the other that I am actually able to come to who I am. Not necessarily inventing yourself, but allowing yourself to be called forth. Much like sacramental reality, allow yourself to be called forth into who you are, but only by the willingness to look into that abyss and to believe that in that abyss there is some sense of hope, there is some sense of truth, and even more so, there is a relationship or a set of relationships that will continue to sustain and move forward beyond the apparent loss. So it has a deep, deep impact on the concreteness of humanity, and this is expressed through affectivity. By being affected by death is affectivity, a certain passivity, something we can't avoid. It's already working upon us, even working within us from our, we've so clearly put this morning in our first plenary talk, death is at work in us. And as it's already stated in Paul's letters, death is at work in me. But even greater than death in that work is something we have to look for. So being affected beyond measure, that already calls us forth to something greater. An affection of the present by what is exceedingly greater than what is apparent to us now, and has a certain sense of intimacy to it. That can many times feel like this leads us to agnosticism, a mystery that's just completely ineffable and particularly beyond us. We can't name it, therefore how can I relate to it? But actually quite the opposite happens. It inheres in us in a new way where we actually can develop a capacity for compassion and the interpersonal that allows us to actually grow beyond and be closer united to it. So a depth of intimacy actually comes through this form of phenomenological encounter. So this moment of transformation should naturally at the human level lead to some derivative effects. And one of the derivative effects should be service. The sense of, I want to embrace this truth of transformation and to serve others. Simply to serve is the place where I can live this truth out. And through that service, you begin to establish meaningful practices, meaningful relationships, and meaningful cultures and communities. And this meaning actually then stands not within the horizon of death any longer. It came through the horizon of nothingness, it came through the horizon of death, but now it's able to stand out above and beyond that. Memory, you can say, is only constituted through this experience of meaning. Why would we remember anything unless it meant something to us? So in the sense of, you always talk about kairos and chronos. Kairos is able to exceed chronos because there's a memory that happens at an interpersonal level that is able to exceed the chronological order, sort of burst beyond it, and remain alive beyond the passing away in the chronological sense. So, Levinas takes that sort of reflection there and then uses that as a way to define what the soul is. The soul is this practice of engagement with the mystery, with other persons, with the struggles, the joys, and everything else we can't calculate. And the allowance of that new emergence within us is a very identity, greater than even a proof of a living soul. And not your soul, but the souls of others. There is no soul that stands alone. It's always souls in relationship with each other, persons in relationship with each other, because that reality, that awakening to that truth, can only happen through the other. And this is actually a great insight into the Trinitarian God as monotheism, simply that a monotheistic God is a singular person. We require engagement, we require otherness, even in the depths of the heart of God. So, a beautiful quote that it sort of captures the sense of eternal, immutable reality, and also personal dimension to it, is the death of the other who dies. This is he uses in other texts the notion of kenosis. He addresses his self-emptying. The death of the other who dies affects me in the very identity as I am responsible to, quote-unquote, the me that emerges. We're always growing into a new me through the deaths of the ones around us. It affects me by a non-substantial. Therefore, it's changing, it's moving, it's becoming something even more mysterious in a sense, yet more intimate. which is not the simple coherence of various acts into one unit of identity, but is made by an ineffable responsibility. My responding to the other forms the identity, not just some sort of deposit of a definition, but a literal action and activity that we live out. So I'll move this on. This is a great parallel here where we now can move into some of the traditional language of the Philokia and the Fathers, where I think many times gets lost in our modern language because doesn't connect, doesn't bridge. But the practices and the ideas actually link in their own way, not as a pure synthesis and not as a pure sort of like they're saying exactly the same thing, because they're not. But it shows you a very close relationship of these ideas, and where we can use the tradition of one in relationship to the tradition of another to move forward together and new insights and new experiences of our faith.
Thank you. So let's move a little bit our attention to some patristic thoughts in this direction. And I just would like to emphasize that the fathers of our church insist that there is an intimate connection of soul and body that implies that they act simultaneously in every human activity, and they partake of the same emotions. In other words, the fathers stress that there is a common activity between body and soul in sins in the same way that is in passions and in virtues. And I would like to take a little bit of discussion towards the passions, because I think there is a very distorted secular definition of what these passions are, and this, if we would have the ability or the availability to look at the fathers of the church and the writings of a couple of hundred years ago, maybe more than 1,000, some of them, then we will find perhaps the reality of our souls in those writings. And by identifying ourselves with that writings, it will show that the human beings and the souls have not changed. The circumstances around us are changed. So the passions, first I would like to give a definition, should not be understood as human emotions, but rather as vices precluding obedience to the Word of God. This is from Clement of Alexandria and John of Damascus. The fathers of the church teaches us that such passionate person will be preoccupied with satisfying their own desires for pleasure, wealth, and praise, and will fail to attend to or to cultivate the true virtues of compassion and mercy. What would be the impact of this passion? I would say that they can blind these great human abilities that are given as gift by grace of God to each single one of us. They can de-enchant the human soul and block the development of the true virtues and become barrier to compassion and love, which is so important for our lives as a community. And what will be the remedy for this? The Fathers gives us the solutions too. It's the purity of heart. And if we go back and try to read a little bit from the Fathers, what purity of heart is the default place of rest, while all harsh and unhealthy fears are at peace. We renounce our former way of life, and we go deeper inside of our hearts and renounce our afflictive thoughts with ceaseless prayer that maintains a warm, devoted heart that has compassion to the others. The self empties out through Christ. The constant battle with our thoughts happens over and over again, and is wise to catch them early with humble expectation. The work of sorting our thoughts is called discernment. To summarize, the pursuit of virtue in the Christian ascetic tradition is ultimately the struggle to acquire a compassionate heart and demonstrate mercy towards every human being and creation. The ascetic fathers describe the passion as barriers to manifesting true love. Here it's just a narration of passions. how those could be perhaps correlated with some psychiatric nomenclature from today's psychiatry. Passion of pride with narcissism, passion of fear with anxiety and anguish, neurotic phobias, passion of anger with aggressiveness, acedia, being a debilitated state of mind, sadness, depressive symptoms, passion of gluttony, that leads to so many and multiple very difficult eating disorders that psychiatry is confronting with today in contemporary times. But out of this old passions, certainly we don't have time to go to all of them. Fathers of the Church are categorizing the top three as acedia, vainglory, and pride. And I'll simply rest a little bit on acedia, which is considered the first affliction of the soul, and is defined as a certain state of laziness, including a state of boredom, involving disgust, aversion, lassitude, dejection, discouragement, apathy, torpor, nonchalance, drowsiness, somnolence, and heaviness of the body, both the body and the soul. It is a generalized obscuring of the soul or nous, becoming incapable of apprehending essential truths. The seeker's ability to discern sleeps. He or she is separated from reason and awareness. This toxic fatigue puts the soul to sleep. The mind is sluggish and thoughts are slow and diminished. There is an irritability of spirit, profound boredom, and discontent toward one's current condition. Acedia leads to soul death. It is considered very dangerous in the manipulation of the members of the group. If in case we're talking, for example, about a monastic community, Saint Cassian advised the monastics not to keep company with those that are afflicted by acedia, and to set clear boundaries as a starting place for dialogue. The remedies of acedia are solitude and compunction. The retraction in solitude with oneself held in one meditation, not for the sake of being alone, but for the sake of one being with God. The cell of the monk is also permanent remembering of death, so there is no running from denying death. Compunction, according to Philokalia, is the state of one who becomes aware of his distance of God. Interior dialogue is being away of self-chatter and towards God. Christ consciousness emerge. The I, thought, continues to watch and pray. So the fathers of the Church are also giving us the remedies for these passions, and I believe they are common in pretty much all traditions. But the prayers, the fasting, the alms-giving, guarding our thoughts and mindfulness of oneself are certainly the ones that are very important. And I would like to talk a little bit about a more practical aspect of alms-givings versus charitable work. This is something that is very dear to myself, as I do this charitable work for more than 6 years, approximately 7 years, with St. Paraskev Orthodox Charity, which I co-founded and I'm leading right now as a volunteer of our own volunteers. So I came to learn in these 7 years the actual transformative power of charity, where you do the work for others, not expecting anything in return. And I could really identify in many of my journeys with Francis of Assisi, which teaches us, for it is in giving that we receive. We also have a booth outside, so I will be very happy to talk to you more about our work and our charity. But one thing that strikes me basically is the way how the contemporary secular society looks at its charitable work, and how this has been moved away from the biblical definition of what charity is about. And when we do charity, we expect something. We expect payments or salaries or some remuneration. But I want to bring attention a little bit to what does it mean to give and to care. And I think that's linked to, as well, to our community relationship with each other, to our practice and care for patients if we are doing that job, or practice and care for parishioners or in any group or community, for students, for example, because I'm teaching in the last 12 years. So these two aspects of life are very naturally linked to each other, and St. Augustine in the Catholic Church, and it's considered felicit, the blessed in the Orthodox Church, teaches us that you should be giving with equal love to the worthy and to the unworthy. So in giving to the unworthy, you don't miss the worthy. Very interesting aspect. And one of the points of discussion or argumentation here would be that we're not provided with the gifts to see in the heart of the other. I thought that's very interesting when giving, trying to give, you put a lot of rules and regulations and you need to follow them. We also been made aware to be mindful about inertia of life, the flesh, or living life without mindfulness. And also always be reminded about the golden rule, Matthew 7:12, which simply tells us that all that you may desire that people do for you, likewise you also do for them, for this is the law and the prophets. St. John of Kronstadt tells us that life without effort isn't an effort, it's something monstrous. It's the duty of all of us to strive relentlessly without ceasing against the inertia of flesh. May God preserve every Christian from this weakness. The therapeutic effect of charitable work to the soul are fighting the atomization of contemporary life that has pervaded even one's goodness. And today, one may even have a sense of goodness without actually doing anything good. Against this unnatural, absurd attitude, we have the constant reminder of the golden rule, Matthew 7:12. Naturally, when it comes to ourselves being in need, we would desire action and not the distant and disengaged sense of goodness in our fellow human beings observed from a remote distance. To put it bluntly, no one can be charitable from a distance and without relentlessness and selfless effort. And I would like now to turn to some conclusions. Rick, if you want to.
Now, the topic of resiliency is where we'll conclude quickly. There's a few different perspectives up here. Simply, the clarity that came through our work here is that resiliency has many different sources, and there is a resiliency to sin, and that Acedia, that Acedia in itself, is that queen of all sinful dispositions. It's that nihilism. Nihilism is very resilient. But what is even more resilient than this is the resurrection. And in some way, this awakening of the soul is already a premonition of the resurrection. This baptism by fire, baptism by openness, but also obviously the sacraments of the church and that community brought in, has its own resilience. And in some way, each of us have to become more sensitive, more discerning of those different resilient sources within our own lives and our own communities, and work to build a resiliency towards infinite, eternal life, rather than a resiliency that's locked up in death and that which ends. So, by death, death is coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that very thought-provoking presentation. Any questions on the floor? Yes, please.
Oh, yeah.
I believe that you had the word empathy in the title. I don't think you addressed it a lot. I know that coming to this conference I have to put my best behavior, but allow me for a bit to be the devil's advocate. And I hope I don't stand a chance. But I would say that my client is very empathic as well. And as that Russian gentleman, blessed be his memory, called Dostoevsky, showed in the tale of the great Inquisitor, it showed that the Lord has been unduly empathic for very few and quite unempathic for people who have their needs for the earthly things, and the Lord doesn't show much empathy for them, and that needed to be corrected. So, because we live in such a time, I'm going to derail right now from my devil's advocate position, but because we live in a world where there is a lot of empathy being claimed to be given for what it is considered a passion, and we as a church have somehow to respond to this. I'm wondering if you can offer some thoughts about this.
I really, it's much more in the Orthodox Eastern Christian traditions where we hear this title, by death is conquered. This to me is a different criteria of empathy. Empathy can only be experienced through this sense of true loss. This is why I think the engagement with nihilism, the engagement with Holy Saturday, is so critical to the human person, not to speak of the theological faith, because it's only there where a criteria for what empathy actually can be, and they did stress on it with Levinas in particular. Empathy is a derivative. The experience of death and the experience of the other going towards God is beyond empathy. So there's even greater criteria than empathy to this experience. So the abuse and distortion of empathy in our culture are many times, yes, they can be stepping stones on a ladder to help someone move in a direction. Sometimes it's down, sometimes it's up. Doesn't mean empathy is not there. This is why it's sort of tricky. What matters is the direction of the bonding, the relationship that's being called forth has to have actually something greater than empathy. But in the medical and clinical context, you have to meet your people right where they're at. And this is why I think his patient-doctor sort of bedside manner with the children, very empathetic in the sense of not only where they're at now, but also the sociological context that they will have to confront to where they go, right? It could create a particular bond between him and the patient in the saint, or a theological reality that when brought into the family life may create more problems. So wisdom always has to be discerned. As for the Grand Inquisitor, to be quite trite and to be quite quick, I don't think Dostoevsky thought enough about the icon and the feast of the wedding of the king.
Right. It's very interesting that Rick just brought this to, it just came to my mind, the same example from the Bible, but I gather from your question that you're basically asking, is there limits to empathy? That was my perception. And I believe those limits to empathy are put on directly proportional, to put it in a mathematical language, with the passions we carry in our heart. The passions, the more you kill your passions, the more unlimited you're going to be. That requires work of yourself. The problem is not the patient, never the patient is the problem. I think the problem is the attitude toward that particular patient. And the understanding of that state of soul of that particular patient, it's going to be affected by your passions. And if you don't realize myself, I can give you my pragmatic journey, so to speak. During my journey with charity, I realized how limited I am. And I realized how much I needed to stretch myself to understand the other by me, in their own needs. And our speaker in the first presentation mentioned that we're just instruments. I truly, truly empathize with that statement. Because I came to realize through my journey that I'm a simple instrument, and the charity I do, St. Alms-Giving really does the work. I'm just there to fulfill whatever I can with my limited abilities. I don't know if this is answering some of the thoughts, but that's my